Okay, well, one of the ways to get the top grades when you're thinking about the theme of greed in A Christmas Carol is to realise that it's almost not really a theme. And in this video, I'm going to show you 11 quotations to give you those top grades. Let's start with the easiest and the most important. Scrooge goes home before he meets Marley's ghost in the flesh, and he eats a bowl of gruel. Now, this is useful evidence to prove that Scrooge is not greedy. He does have an issue of accumulating money, but it is for its own sake. He doesn't have any other greedy appetites. He doesn't enjoy luxuries. He doesn't spend the money on himself. Now, Dickens makes this really clear in his choice of gruel, because this is the food, a kind of disgusting watery porridge, that the poor would be served in the workhouse. They would be given it because it is the cheapest kind of food that you can give. Take the water out and it's basically what you'd feed a horse. Now, in his later novel, Oliver Twist, that's exactly what Scrooge gives Oliver Twist. You remember that scene, "Please, sir, can I have some more?" where he gets into such trouble asking for more of this disgusting food. So Scrooge himself is not the symbol of greed. Let's go deeper. Scrooge actually denies himself pleasures. Listen to this. "I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry." So Scrooge clearly is not greedy. But this view that he has, that he doesn't want to give the idle poor money, is not a characteristic of Scrooge on his own. Scrooge is using the words that were popular in society. Scrooge's readers would be used to this expression, the idle poor. The implication being that the poor are poor because they deserve it. They don't work hard enough, they don't save enough, they go out drinking all the time, and they just don't lead decent lives. Why then should we, as wealthy or well-off individuals, contribute money to them? They'll only go and waste it and continue to be idle. So, the greed that's in this novel is actually the greed of the reader. And it's not the normal sense of greed that's looking for extra. It's that sense of greed that helps you hang on to what you've got and refuse to give it to your fellow man because you look down on them. Now, you're also used to this idea of Scrooge using the words that are attributed to Malthusian politics. So the Reverend Thomas Malthus published this economic treatise which suggested that the poor were a drain on the population. They were surplus because they didn't produce enough goods and they still consumed lots of goods. In other words, the more poor people there are in society, the less food there is to go around. And actually, the only solution is to reduce the number of poor people. Now, Scrooge interprets this as letting poor people die or sending them to the workhouse or to prison. But that's very similar to society's idea about the idle poor. Now, interestingly, the Reverend Thomas Malthus wasn't interested in the idea of killing off poor people. He just wanted them to marry later and have fewer children. But it's politicians in Dickens' time who have taken this really quite sensible message and applied it really cruelly to society, so that we have the workhouse and the prison. Something which Dickens detested, which is why he puts his main character, Oliver, in Oliver Twist, into the workhouse from which he must escape. So when we talk about greed now, it is the greed of society. And Dickens isn't suggesting that everyone who's rich is greedy. What he's suggesting is that society is organised in such a way that all the wealth goes to a few people while the majority are still poor. To drive that message home, he introduces these four characters: Old Joe, the undertaker's man, the laundress, and the charwoman. These are the characters who steal from Scrooge's dead corpse. This is what I write about it in my guide. Imagine a middle-class Victorian household. You would have a maid who did all your cleaning, you might have a cook, you would definitely have a laundress who would do all your laundry for you, and you would employ a gardener and someone else to do your household maintenance when you needed it. You would probably employ a governess to educate your children and somebody to help you in the nursery with young children. Food would be delivered daily by different stores, as in fact we see at the end with the boy who goes to get the turkey for Scrooge. So this means the well-off Victorian family would have an enormous number of employees who depended on them for a salary or income. Now, when Dickens introduces these as thieves, he's not suggesting that the working classes are therefore necessarily full of criminals. Quite the opposite. What he's suggesting is the amount that the wealthy, or just the well-off, pay to these poor employees is so little that they have to steal to make ends meet. When we see this scene, we find that they are all incredibly polite to each other, which doesn't really go with this image. Let's try a different one. Here you can see that they look like ordinary, decent people. They're not the criminals of this kind of image, but actually the kinds of people that you would meet in everyday Victorian life. Look at what the worst of them says, the one who's stolen the most. "Let the charwoman alone be the first," she says, of herself, cried she who had entered first. "Let the laundress alone to be the second, and let the undertaker's man alone to be the third." So because she feels a little bit guilty about having stolen so much, she's willing to put her things up first, knowing that old Joe won't necessarily want to give her a great price for them. Instead, the undertaker's man insists that he ought to go first, because then he might get the lowest price for his goods. What we see then is not just incredible good manners, but each person trying to look out for the economic welfare of their fellow thieves. Dickens is trying to show how criminals are not evil, they are driven to their crime here by the poor wages that they're given. Now you might argue, how do we know that? Maybe they're getting quite a bit of money and are quite well off. Well, the way Dickens proves that to us is by introducing us to Old Joe. Old Joe is nearly 70 years of age, and he's described, ironically, as having the luxury of calm retirement. Well, of course, he isn't retired. He's still dealing in stolen goods, and he lives in terribly poor conditions, which Dickens emphasises comically by getting Old Joe to invite everyone in to the parlour. The parlour would be the best room in the house in Victorian times, whereas here the parlour was the space behind the screen of rags. So you can see, even after a lifetime of crime and dealing in stolen goods, poor old Joe is still forced to deal in stolen goods because he doesn't have any money. So Dickens' political point is that the poor are actually kept poor by the people who are paying them for work. There isn't a living wage. People aren't getting paid enough, therefore they have to turn to crime. So perhaps it isn't Scrooge who is greedy, but society, or at least those well off enough to be employers, which I showed you was every household. Let's look at some fascinating facts about income. This is a maid of all work. Every house would have at least one of them if you were at all middle class. So Lisa Pickard, in an article at the British Library, defines the middle class as a bank clerk who would earn somewhere between £90 and £100 a year. Bob is not working for a big institutional bank, he's working in a tiny business. He is Scrooge's only employee, and he earns £39 a year, so less than half of a middle-class bank clerk. Bob, therefore, is working class. But a bank clerk would walk 3 miles to work, which is exactly what Bob walks from Camden Town to Scrooge's place of business. A maid of all work who had to maintain and clear, why does that say clearing? It should be cleaning, Mr. Salles, cleaning a Victorian home would earn only £6 a year. Now, why is this relevant? Well, because what this means is that Scrooge pays the going rate. Yes, he's a miser and he doesn't spend any of his own money when he doesn't have to, but he does have to pay the going rate in order to get someone to work for him. So what he pays Bob, those 15 shillings a week, isn't an indication of how stingy and cruel and mean and horrible Scrooge is. No, it's a symbol of how tight-fisted society is. Those with the money, those middle-class people who can afford to employ maids of all work and the rest of them, they are the ones who are greedy and not giving people a living wage. Now, why did this happen? Well, if the average family size was around 10 children, Dickens' family was 10 children, for example, and if you were also poor, those children wouldn't grow up with an education. They wouldn't be able to get the middle-class jobs like being a bank clerk, or even the sort of job that Bob gets. They would have to start work right at the bottom of the social ladder, which would mean they would just get paid so little. Why would employers not pay more? Well, why bother? If every time you advertise for a job, 50 people turn up to do it, what's the point in raising the wages? So now we can see that Dickens' real beef is not with Scrooge's greed, but with the greed of society that is set up in this way to exploit the poor. Okay, Mr. Salles, you might say, but what about when Belle, his fiancée, says in the past, "Another idol has displaced me, a golden one"? Surely that's proof that Scrooge has become addicted to greed. Well, yes and no. A golden idol is a reference to the Bible, to heathens. A golden idol would be worshipped by people and populations who did not believe in Jehovah in the Old Testament or the New Testament God and Jesus. Therefore, someone who believes in a golden idol is turning away from their Christian values. Well, Dickens does spend a lot of time trying to show that Scrooge has turned away from Christian values, but Dickens' point is a lot of society has turned away from these Christian values as well. The other thing this means is that Scrooge worships gold. He's not greedy in any other way. He worships gold so much that he pretty much refuses to spend it even on himself. So yes, he is an absolute miser, but he is not himself greedy. How is he different from society? Well, those good families employing poor people to do their work for them wouldn't consider themselves greedy at all. They would consider themselves very fair, paying the going wage to all these people whose lives they make better by giving them employment. But if that going rate is not enough for them to live healthy lives, to feed their children, to keep them warm and to clothe them, then who is worse? Scrooge, who keeps his money and doesn't spend it, or the reader who spends the money on lots of employees by making sure they stay poor? Just in case we haven't got this message and we think that Scrooge is just a terrible human being who represents greed, Dickens introduces a couple who benefit from Scrooge's death. Scrooge asks the ghost of Christmas yet to come to show him someone who feels emotion caused by this man's death. Remember that he doesn't know this man is in fact Scrooge himself. And so the ghost takes him to meet a wife who's sitting at home worried, and a husband comes in, and he's absolutely delighted that Scrooge is dead. And we might think, oh, well, obviously that means he's not going to have to pay back his loan at so great an interest, because nobody else would be as greedy as Scrooge. But no, all he hopes to get is a week's delay. So Dickens' point here is that whichever businessman takes over Scrooge's business, they're going to be exactly the same as Scrooge. They're going to charge exactly the same interest rate. In other words, Scrooge is like every other man of business. Yes, he's unusual in that he hates people at the beginning and that he keeps all his money to himself, but he doesn't rip people off. He just charges people the going rate. This is Dickens' way of saying it's society that is full of greedy acts. even if the people themselves don't know they're greedy. Because every other businessman behaves the same way. They've got no decent standards to compare it to. And this is why he ends Stave 5 in the novel this way. Yep, he sets it up so that Scrooge meets the charity worker who was asking for money earlier on, and he gives the man an enormous sum, which he says is a great many back payments on all the charity that he should have given. But then he moves on to the more important event where Scrooge takes Bob Cratchit and starts to tell him about how he's going to raise his salary. Why does Dickens do this? Well, because it is not Scrooge's generosity as a human being with charity that is going to change the world. Yes, that will change some people's lives, but if every employer, which is basically everyone who's reading this book in 1843, if all of them increase the salaries of all the people who work for them, then the whole of society will be better off. Everybody will be better off, and society will cease to be greedy. So, greed has not been Scrooge's problem, it has been society's problem, and it is the reader's problem. And you'll know from my previous videos that the reader was wealthy. We know this because there was a limited print run priced at 5 shillings, which is a third of Bob Cratchit's salary. This was an expensive book, especially so Dickens could reach readers with money, because it's readers with money who are going to start paying decent salaries and therefore improve society. And part of Dickens' genius, of course, is that this message came out on the 19th of December, just before Christmas, when people would be in a much better mood to give. Now, I hope you're desperate for more Grade 9 ideas appearing on the left up here or above the golden egg. I tell you, it took me 6 weeks to find this in Tesco's, and I spent £5,000 on eggs, which is more than the golden egg is worth. What was I thinking?